Good afternoon and welcome to those of you in the room and those of you in the Zoom. Delightful to be back with you with WARF Essential Topics. My name is Laura Heisler and I'm Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. And it is my pleasure to bring you today's session. Before we get started, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are on, those of us here in the room and probably many of you in the Zoom, and recognize that UW-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Teejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state governments repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. If you will allow me just a moment to introduce some housekeeping notes for how this session will go. In a moment, I'll be turning things over to our moderator. We will have presentations from some folks from UW-Madison on details about professional conflicts of interest. Then we will be fielding your questions. For those of you in the room, we have a microphone in the middle of the room, and we do ask that you bring your question to the mic so that we can capture it for the recording, and also folks in the room and online can hear your question. If you're online and you have a question, please use the Q&A function and I will be your spokesperson and I will read your question, and our moderator will note when I raise my hand to say there's an online question, and we'll alternate if need be. So please rest assured that if you're online, we still want your questions. With that, I am delighted to introduce our moderator today. Stephanie Adamani is General Counsel for WARF, and she will be leading the session and helping us hear from our UW-Madison experts. So with that, I will turn things over to Stephanie.
Thanks. Thank you, Laura, and thank you to all of you who are joining today in person and those of you online as well. So I'm just going to introduce the panel today. We have some guests here who are going to be speaking on the topic, presenting some slides. That's Stephanie Leroy and Sam Liedweber, who are with the Office of Research Policy. They're both specialists in the conflict of interest process at the university. That process was updated, the policy and procedures were updated, I believe it was during COVID, but correct me if I'm wrong. And I think like many people, it's hard to digest the information that came out during COVID. There's a bit of like, wait, when did that happen? How long ago was that? We've been in this fugue state for a while here. So I think it's timely and really important to hear from them again. Also, I think this is one of those topics that really fully lands when you are in a situation where you need to know the information. So if you're in the audience today or listening online, keep that in mind as you consider what questions you might want to raise after they're done presenting. As Laura said, we'll be taking questions. I think there's a lot of detail here and hopefully some good questions as well. From WARF's perspective, we work with a lot of with PIs on campus, with researchers on campus who start companies and who are entrepreneurial. So I think that from my lens is a really interesting one. We of course want to preserve research integrity and manage the public perceptions about conflicts as well as actual conflicts. So I will have a few questions toward the end to that genre of things that come up. And so with that, I won't spend any more time taking time away from Stephanie and Sam, who have put together a slideshow today and a brief discussion to just get you up to speed on all the basics and the new information. So with that, I think I'm turning over to Sam first. So welcome, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Sam Weinweber. I'm a third name on the slide here, and I've worked at UW with Brian and Stephanie since 2015. During that time, the outside activities report has definitely developed and grown as the form has been used to be responsive to new and different policies. While I think it's good that people are able to enter all of their information onto one form and avoid some redundancies, it also tends to lead to questions about the underlying policies. So I have some of those policies listed here. And as you can see, UW system policies require us to file an outside activities report annually before April 30th, and then within 30 days of any changes. And the state of Wisconsin also has laws concerning the use of state property for personal or private benefit, and from negotiating on both sides of a contract that's known as a self-dealing statute. We also have federal regulations that require us to manage financial conflicts of interest with respect to research bias. And UW policies extend those regulations to all federally funded research and human subjects research as well. So before going into what to report on your outside activities report, I thought it'd be good to think about the aims of the policies on the previous slide a little bit more broadly. So the conflict of interest ones, I think, are pretty clear. We need to manage financial conflicts of interest when there's overlap between people's private financial interests and their research. And I think it's important to note that unlike some other institutions, we're pretty permissive when it comes to that. We don't prohibit those situations from arising. Instead, we try to manage them, and most of the management is done through targeted disclosures. So if you have an equity interest in a company that's related to your research, we ask that you disclose that on relevant publications and presentations, and then inform your lab and your department. When it comes to the state laws and other policies on the previous slide, I think they're all pretty much reducible to making sure that people don't use state resources for their personal gain. So this would include your time and UW salary towards outside activities, involving your students and staff in your outside activities, or using university space, lab equipment, intellectual property, including trademark, for your personal benefit. So when it comes to what to report on your outside activities report, the first thing you need to do is let us know about financial compensation you're receiving for outside professional work that is related to your UW work and research, equity interests in companies that are related to your institutional responsibilities here at UW, and any executive or fiduciary roles you have for outside organizations that are related to your field of work at UW-Madison. So when it comes to financial compensation, the question we most generally receive concerns what's related to somebody's UW work. And for the most part, if you're working outside of the university professionally, you're using the same skill set you do in your role here, and it needs to be reported. One thing that sometimes happens is that people will mistakenly report compensation that's actually going to UW first. So for example, if there's a sponsored research agreement, and that's not an outside activity because it's part of your UW work and it doesn't need to be reported on your OAR. When it comes to equity interests and companies. The question we most commonly receive concerns funds or investment portfolios. And if you don't have control over the investments being made, you don't need to report it on your OAR. Executive and fiduciary roles need to be reported because you have a legal obligation to act in that organization's best interests. So it needs to be reported regardless of compensation that may be received. And I think the only thing that comes up with this is that sometimes somebody's part of a subcommittee, for example, one that's organizing a conference, and they may be the secretary or treasurer for that subcommittee, and those legal duties aren't present in those roles, and so they don't need to be subject to the same reporting rules for the outside activities report. So when it comes to conflicts of commitment, more specifically, I think it's good to think about activities as being in one of two groups. So one of those groups is ordinary institutional activities. And the same rules from the previous slide apply. So if you receive compensation for them or are a fiduciary for an organization, you need to report that on your outside activities report. There is one exception to this, and that's federal grant panel review work. If you receive compensation for that, you don't need to report it on your OAR. And as you may have seen, or ordinary institutional activities are typically scholarly or service activities that you're basically doing as part of your UW work. So these would include occasional lectures, review panels, as I mentioned, or other positions in professional societies. So if something's not related to your UW work, for example, being a youth soccer coach, you don't need to report it on your OAR. And if there are any questions about an activity and whether it falls into this category, it's up to your dean's office to decide whether it does. All other activities are going to be outside professional activities. And generally, people are going to be compensated for these. But if you have an honorary academic appointment or are volunteering on a scientific advisory board, it's still something that needs to be reported on your outside activities report because of the time commitment involved and the conflict of commitment issues that may raise. So Stephanie will go into that policy a bit more now.
As Sam said, sometimes you still need to report activities on your outside activities report, even if you are not getting compensated for it, because it takes up a significant amount of your time. And UW-Madison's expectation is that the primary professional skills, obligations, and work effort of its faculty are committed to UW-Madison. And this is in line with pretty much every other major university in the United States and pretty much every full-time job you've ever had as well. And it's been UW-Madison's expectation for many years at this point. And to make sure everyone is meeting those expectations under the conflict of commitment policy, faculty members must disclose time committed to outside activities on their outside activities report. If a faculty member's aggregate time commitment towards outside activities will exceed, on average, more than the equivalent of 2 8-hour days per calendar month per year, regardless of when this occurs, the faculty member must receive prior written permission from their dean or dean's designee. And although schools and colleges can implement stricter policies, the COC policy essentially says that if you expect to spend more than, on average, 2 days a month, you need to seek permission in advance. And that's the key to the COC policy versus the COI policies. You need to seek permission in advance from your dean's office. And it's not enough to report the activity on your OAR. You have to put in a separate request within the OAR system. So you'd first submit your activity where the green button says update your OAR. So you're going to add an activity, because why would you be spending additional time on something if you haven't already reported it on your OAR. So you start with that, and then you can see under activities there, it says new in 2021, view add time commitment request. And that is where you will need to submit prior to going over the 2 days a month, the request to your dean's office, and just put in details of what the activity is, why you're doing it, and why you think it is still necessary beyond the 2 day a month allotment. And whether commitment to an outside activity impacts university performance is again determined by your deans, the dean of the faculty member's school or college tenure home. So not necessarily, if you have more than one appointment, you're definitely going to be deferring to your tenure home unless circumstances warrant that such a determination be made by a provost or a chancellor. And that's typically going to be if you are a dean yourself or a center director, then you'd be seeking permission from the provost or chancellor. Another reporting requirement that has come about recently is interactions with foreign entities. Time commitments, honoraria, research, and travel support from foreign entities need to be reported in bio sketches and other support pages in federal grants applications. RSP has more information on their website about this through this link, or if you just go search their main homepage, it's pretty prominent right on the front there. And this is in addition to the requirement. Oops. This is in addition to the requirement of reporting time and compensation on your OAR. So there's a lot of things we need to keep track of in terms of reporting, and foreign entities is one of them, but that's mainly going to be on your bio sketches. So I'm just going to run through quickly the difference between, I guess, go through the OAR process to try to distinguish it from the conflict of commitment process. So annually, every year, everyone who is a faculty member of any appointment level, academic staff at 50% or greater, those listed on federal grants, and anyone listed as a study team member on a human subjects protocol must submit an OAR through our OAR portal. And you must also update your OAR within 30 days of any changes through our system. After that, the COI committee reviews the OARs at our monthly meeting, and we will determine if a management plan is necessary. If we decide a management plan is necessary, the COI office, which is Sam and I, will send out email notices of the assignment of that management plan and the requirements. And we also will copy your department chair and your dean's office so they know that you have a management plan. Now, once you get that management plan, if you happen to have a human subjects protocol that is related to that managed activity, you need to notify the IRB within 30 days of receiving that management plan. Within 90 days of your management plan, you need to go online, accept it, set up a meeting with your department chair, and send out an email disclosure to all of your collaborators and those that you supervise in the course of your research. And we have templates for those things online, so you don't have to make them up. And after your first year of having a management plan, those last two things that I mentioned, those are annual requirements. So you'll need to meet with your department chair annually, and you'll also need to send out an email disclosure annually. And here's another view in case you prefer not looking at a flow chart, but a grid view. So the COC process is, like I showed on this page. So once you fill out your OAR, you'll go back and you'll click the add view time request button, put in your information, and then an email gets sent to your dean's office and with all the information to do the review for your COC request. And then once it's done being reviewed, you'll get an email back to you to say you can go online and see if it's been, accepted or or approved or needs further information. So once you submit your conflict of commitment request, that's going to be handled entirely by your dean's office. So contacting Sam and I to try to review it quicker for you isn't really going to help. If you have questions, you'll definitely want to contact your dean's office. And I think that's all we had for now. So if you guys want to join me up on stage, we can do panel discussion.
Thank you, Sam and Stephanie. We've also got, we're also going to be joined up here by Brian Fox. He's the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research Policy and Integrity. And then Beth Myron, the Vice Provost for Faculty and Staff Affairs. I know both of them have had a lot of experience with UW, and Brian has spoken before on panels about conflict of interest at the UW as well. So I want to let each person just talk a little bit about their experience, I guess, with this, and then I will tee up a few questions that I've got here. Thanks.
I guess I'll start. We haven't, I mean, Sam and I mostly work on the conflict of interest portion, but we do provide support for conflict of commitment, especially support with the website and getting things submitted properly. But most of the time, like I just said, that we're gonna probably refer you to your dean's office for conflict of commitment, but we can handle, at this point, we've been here for 6 years, so we can probably handle any conflict of interest question you can throw at us.
Yeah, and to the extent the conflict of commitment and COI issues are interrelated, we're happy to help direct people to where they need to be.
So in my role as Vice Provost for Faculty and Staff Affairs, I direct folks to different pieces of information and try to help them understand the policy and the process, try to direct them to the appropriate people in their dean's offices to answer questions. And I've also been a department chair myself, so I'm familiar with approving these different management plans and things of that nature.
Yeah. So hi, and thank you all for coming. We appreciate that you would spend your time on this topic with us. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research Policy and Integrity here. And one of the issues is managing the outside activities reporting requirement for us that helps us meet both state and federal regulations. I'm glad you all came. I hope you can ask questions, what might concerns or general broad topic areas. We'd be glad to try to engage with you. It's nice, friendly, small audience, so please feel free.
I'll just start with a question. I wondered for students, whether they be undergraduates, graduate students, or postdocs, how do these policies apply to them as well? Or are they obligated to fill out any of these forms?
Yes, yes, they do apply. So students can be listed on human subjects protocols, and that will trigger the need for an outside activities report. And to the extent postdocs or graduate students are UW employees, the conflict of commitment policy does apply to them as well.
Thank you. Thanks. So I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we do at WARF is we work with faculty that are interested in commercializing an idea or some research or a patent that they have. And I'm wondering how often any of you are seeing that come up in your roles, or what is the procedure for that? When would they start? You know, sometimes there's an incubation period to the idea. So when would they ideally come with this idea that they're going to be working on a startup?
Well, I guess in terms of reporting to us, the OAR and conflict of commitment is really focused on entities. So until there's actually an entity formed, there's nothing to report to us. But you do want to still keep in mind like how much time you are committing to it prior to it becoming an entity. And then as soon as you file the paperwork and it becomes an LLC or a corporation, you'll want to make sure you update your OIR as soon as possible, but definitely within 30 days.
I think another nice thing when people come to us in advance is that we can plan around other issues that might come up. So if students or faculty members that somebody is working with are going to be involved in the company, other considerations might need to be thought through. And management plans, generally they just involve disclosure, but if somebody is doing human subjects research and the intellectual property may be involved in that research, other restrictions might kick in. And I think it's good to come to us in advance just so we can plan that out and see what can be done about it.
Because if you have ownership in a company, you're going to get a management plan.
So I would like to say one thing. I hope everybody appreciates this. UW-Madison has for decades taken the position that these involvement in these kind of outside activities is something that we try to encourage. We want to understand what people are doing in the context of their work by having a dialogue with them or engaging with them in some way. The outside activities report gets that started. For the most part, our institution figures out a way to manage activities and allow them to proceed. And the simplest way to make sure that that management occurs smoothly and things can proceed is tell us before you get started what you intend to do so that we can all plan. Nobody likes to backtrack. And nobody likes to do things over. So if you take that in mind of what people are trying to do is understand where in your professional commitments this fits in and how the institution would or would not be impacted by various activities.
I've heard you say that message before, and I think it's a really good one because it just does reflect like there is a lot going on campus. We have investigators involved in many different things, and it's not unusual or something that's to be avoided. I always appreciate you making that point, and I think it's a good one. Beth, did you have anything to add to that last question or any of the previous?
No, just to echo real briefly that, as Brian was saying, the intent of this is just to have a conversation and a dialogue. It's not to stop work or put up barriers. It's just to have that conversation. And in many cases, this is something people have been talking to their dean's offices about already anyway. So it really is just to start a conversation, not to put up barriers.
Thanks. Were there any top line changes in the newer policies that rolled out over the last couple of years that you just want to say, like, just this is a big takeaway or a modification to anything that was occurring prior?
Yeah, I can say one thing. So I would like to say to all of us who are recipients of federal grants that the concerns about outside activities related to your federally funded projects has historically been focused on a financial commitment or personal financial interest in the outcome of your federally funded research. Over the last 3 or 4 years, the appreciation of the amount of time that people spend working in outside activities is also a concern because a federal granting agency provides a grant to university and then to the individual with the expectation that there will be sufficient time available to carry out the work. And you can all read in the public press of examples where this trust has seemingly been broken. And when that happens, the federal government pushes down to its sponsors. And so we're living in a world where one is now expected to declare all of your foreign relationships in the progress reports of your grants, in your other support page, to help the reviewers and the federal government understand those time commitments and money commitments have always been there. For me, this is the biggest change, I think, and also the most impactful for you. If you don't report this and it's discovered in some way, and we've all heard of the 1,000 Talents program. People are discovering thousands of talents investigators through automated searches of websites or other things. And so you are much better off to be out in front of this than after the fact. And for me, that's the biggest worry that I've had about the research enterprise.
Thank you.
We do have a number of online questions if you're ready for that.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay, great. And if you have a question, you're in the room, you're welcome to come up to the microphone. The first one, can you hear me? Is that okay? Is how do time commitment rules apply to people with less than one FTE appointment? Meaning, if you're part-time, how does the 2 times 8 hours per month work?
So it's prorated. So somebody with a 50% appointment would have twice as many or half as many days until that threshold is met.
Great. Okay. The next one is can you define a foreign entity for the purposes of these policies?
That would be any institution outside of the US, a private sector company, a government, a institution of higher education not based in the United States. Any country, Europe, China, Japan, South America, anywhere that's outside of the US.
The next one I have, I think you addressed this, but maybe you could expand. Does the time commitment request only pertain to faculty? And I think I heard you mention something about students, but could you say also about staff?
It applies to academic staff as well.
So anyone who's an employee of the university.
Okay.
So if you're a graduate student and you have an RA position, you count.
Postdocs?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Another question online from Stacy Lowe. Given that last year was the first round of conflict of commitment reviews, the focus was more on approving outside work that already had happened or was in process. Stacy says, I don't think people are as familiar with this requirement to request permission in advance. Will there be additional messaging from campus about that? Are there suggested processes for making sure we keep track of these in an ongoing fashion?
So I think the requirement will be mentioned again in our outside activities reporting reminders. And I think it's probably best that workflows are developed by the dean's offices just to suit their needs, because different departments have different ways of organizing who's reporting to who.
Okay, from Josh Hyman, for academic staff, is time on the weekends and evenings considered to be part of the time commitment and limited to 2 days per month?
So for academic staff, we have like our weekends are off, but I think if you have effort reporting requirements and you're 100% on a grant, the rules might be slightly different. I think Brian can
Maybe
elaborate.
I'll say a little bit about this. So all faculty, regardless of appointment, are required to file a report. Academic staff that have a 50% appointment or greater are required to file a report. The conflict of commitment policy really doesn't make a differentiation between whether you do it on the weekend or at night, or what it's asking is the activity related to your professional activities where UW-Madison is paying you? And is asking the question of, a kind of a blunt thing is if you needed to work on a grant because that's part of your university employment and you aren't able to do it on the weekend, is that a commitment of time? And I want to iterate again, the policy is not to say, no, you can't do it. The policy is to engage in a discussion about what you intend to do and what the potential impacts might be. For the most part, we understand that people can do many things at once, and that most activities are going to be approved by a dean's office because the case can be made and understood that participating in more than one thing will not impact your university responsibilities. But no one can know unless we talk about it first.
I have a couple more from online. I may get this pronunciation wrong. I apologize. Moira Shiki is asking, how does UW-Madison and WARF avoid conflicts and potential related undue influence of external actors who hold dual roles as local community leaders, often representing large industry, and university representatives like adjunct faculty? For example, there are leaders of local organizations for the innovation ecosystem who also sit on university committees for innovation awards. I see puzzlement from the panel. Seems like it may not be pertinent because we're really talking about UW employees, right? I guess maybe the question is adjunct faculty.
So I think in those positions, people's role includes or is compatible with their outside work. So maybe you're an adjunct professor at the law school and you're also a partner at a firm. Like those two things are very compatible. And it sounds like it's the same circumstance for the one that was mentioned where people are in the community doing leadership work there, and then they're trying to take those lessons and impart them to people here at the university who hope to do the same thing in the future. So I'm not sure I see too much of a conflict in those situations.
Okay, I'll continue. Valerie Peterson is asking, is there a deadline for yearly OAR reporting? I understand that updates should occur within 30 days, but for my unit, is there a due date or a deadline every year to have reports turned in?
That's April 30th of each year.
Okay, straightforward. Okay, I'm continuing. Most of our audience, obviously, if you don't know, is online. So, anonymous attendee asks, one of my hobbies is a scientific activity as opposed to, for example, a sports activity. I do not currently make money on that hobby, and I do not have a small business related to the hobby. The science related to my hobby is not at all related to my UW professional activities. Does that currently have to be reported?
There's no entity, and so there's nothing to report.
Okay, no entity, so no reporting. Okay, great. Another one, if someone has a rental house, does that person need to report it? No, Brian is saying no.
Not unless they plan to rent it out to like their students or something for a trip.
I mean, the students that are in their employ, one can have a rental property and rent it to the students and a student in general, but not to your employee, please.
Okay, another one. Individuals who both do research and own a company often find information in their research and or clinical work that may be valuable for the company. What mechanisms are in place to allow appropriate sharing of information from UW to the company when the clinician is also a company owner? And they go on to provide an example. For example, a physician invents a device that improves monitoring of patients after a procedure. That FDA-approved device is being used in the clinical setting. In the physician's clinical work, the device provides examples that could be used for monitoring improvement, device improvement, marketing for the company. How can the provider most appropriately share information back to the company?
You want to take that one?
I think there are a lot of issues embedded in that question there. I think sometimes from WARF's perspective, we do see investigators who are involved in a company and also still continuing research at the university. And from my legal perspective on that is it can get really messy because you're wearing two different hats. So who owns what funded what, and then maybe documenting if you're going to be sharing information back and forth with the company, who owns the information? Is it, a university invention or data? And then making sure you just kind of like document the information that flows back and forth, I think can avoid a lot of messy situations later on down the road. And the particulars of the situation will influence kind of how that all happens. So I'm speaking really generally here, but that is one of the things that I think are just really important to keep a clean slate, because you're wearing your university hat and then you're putting it off and going and putting on another hat. And it's very complicated. But I think, as Brian said, there's not a prohibition against it. People are doing a lot of creative and innovative things and trying to find ways to advance research and solve problems for society. So figuring out how to manage that is the relevant question.
So you might advise, if they find themselves in the midst of that
Mhm.
kind of recording, to maybe reach out to OAR and just check in and
Mhm.
design a plan.
Yeah, I would say that that is a very complicated situation that has, potentially a university employee carrying out something inside the university, or a university employee that is carrying out something entirely inside the company.
Mhm.
Those things need to be cleanly understood, and it could be a mixture.
Mhm.
And that's also another, it's an outcome that if you know about it, you respond, and you can plan so that you optimize.
Great. I do have more, but let's take the in the room
Yeah,
question.
great to have a in person.
A couple questions. The first one is the 2-day a month threshold. Is that smaller or about the same as our peer institutions?
That's identical to our peer institutions. I collected a bunch of information from all the Big Ten schools and some of the other same R01 institutions, and 2 days a week. I mean, sometimes they classify it as
2 days a month.
Oh yeah, sorry, 2 days a month. They'll classify it as like a certain number per semester or quarter, depending on how their academic year is set up, but it all equates to 2 days a month.
Okay, I mean, because I guess what I've seen is mostly 1 day a week. So 4 days a month seems typical. The second question is the outside activity reporting is part of the faculty policies and procedures that is approved by the faculty senate, whereas this new conflict of commitment policy did not appear before the Senate. I wonder whether it should be, whether faculty should be participating in the discussion about the thresholds like 2 or 4 days per month, and the question of should this be a disclosure or a pre-approval process?
Well, so this policy needed to emerge because of response to federal government requirements for understanding what the time committed to outside activities was. There's nothing in this proposal that's incompatible with UWS 8, the chapter on the Code of Ethics and Conduct of Faculty and Academic Staff. It extends and clarifies what the university thought should be, how people were behaving. I don't really think there is a faculty senate issue in determining whether or not UWS 8 applies. UWS 8 provides substantial authority to the deans to review all outside activities. And so we've created a process where individuals can report and be evaluated.
The 2 days per month is a new
threshold?
There's no statement on how many days per month. And the 1 day a week that you quoted is not codified in any university policy. It is a general rule of thumb that's been discussed in academia since the late 40s after World War II. Some universities have a numerical statement of that, 1 day a week. Others are more permissive. Many are very much less permissive in not allowing any outside activities without pre-approval. What our proposal does is it gives the faculty and staff the discretion to participate in outside professional activities up to 2 days a month without the need to report. That is quite different than some universities who say no outside activities are permitted without prior approval. So we do provide discretion to individuals to carry out what we consider probably not impactful to their professional activities, but more than 2 days a month has potential to be very disruptive to the duties that someone's expected to carry out as a university employee. And so we ask you to engage with your dean in whether or not that happens. The dean will engage with your chair to help assess whether that happens or not.
The policy itself was modified somewhat after the date it was instituted, but it's not mentioned on the page, the policy itself. In particular, the originally as written and what we read April 30th, there was a distinction between outside professional activities and ordinary professional activities. And the ordinary professional activities changed to ordinary institutional activities. And this happened after the April 30th date. And I was just wondering whether if the policy is modified, will there be notification on the policy itself that it's been modified?
So policy was accepted into the policy library. The change that you're talking about was in the final approval. It's a language change. It doesn't really change intent to better clarify between the two circumstances of institutional activities and outside professional activities. It's now an approved policy of the university. Changes to the policy subsequent to this go through the normal approval process. This is a shared proposal between the provost office and the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Grad Education.
And a last question is that the policy mentions an appeal process. It refers to Faculty Policy and Procedures, Chapter 8, as the method of appeals. But the word appeal does not appear in Chapter 8 of FP&P. So I wonder if it's the grievance process that if I wanted to appeal my dean's decision, would I go through the grievance process?
Yes, yeah, that's the process you'd follow.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a bunch more coming in online. One is, do faculty need to report outside commitment if they're using vacation time?
No.
Okay. The person who asked the question about part-time before would like a little clarification, asking, does working on your, I think this is the same question, does working on your unpaid day count towards your time commitment? Meaning, can one work on their unpaid days plus prorated time commitment requirement?
So that's where I was kind of thinking twice as many, because if you have a week and, well, let's say you're at 40%, so those other 3 days aren't on UW time, and that would be factored in. So you could work on your other activity during that time
Okay.
without it affecting your UW work.
Right, that sounds clear. Okay, great. Another question, if someone has a conflict for religious purposes for working on anything on certain days, does that have to be reported? Like if,
There wouldn't be an entity to report.
right. right,
And
okay.
it generally would not be related to your institutional responsibilities either.
And another one is if an outside entity develops a patent, how are the outside activities reported or referenced in determining the assignment of their patent? Let me read that again. If an outside entity develops a patent, how are the outside activities how are the outside activities report or other disclosures referenced in determining the assignment of that patent? Does that make sense?
To me, that sounds like an equity review process. So I know that faculty and staff have an obligation to disclose. I'm assuming that that is a faculty or staff invention. They disclose through the equity review process that an invention happened, and that's where the university decides whether there are university resources or other funding. That's how I'm hearing that question. And so the determination, that would be a good process to go through, but these folks may have something additional, or I might have heard the question differently.
I think the only thing I'd add is that like patents aren't reported on the outside activities report. It'd be more like the licensing and the company that owns it that would be. So the OAR doesn't determine assignment whatsoever.
Okay, a couple more from Michael Childers. Two different parts. The first is, I believe this is in reference to Brian. Could the gentleman that said that this policy emerges from federal requirements elaborate a little bit more on what this is specifically?
So we have, if you work on a federal grant, you have effort reporting. I think most of us understand that. It's every 6 months, a committed time to the federal grant. That's the origin of why we have this policy, to better understand what is the effort commitment of individuals that have a grant.
All right, sorry, let me go back here. There's, hang on, sorry. Things are coming in both in the chat and the Q&A, so I'm toggling. Michael Childers' next question was, how will you deal with academic freedom issues arising by requiring people to ask for approval for activities they conduct on their own time?
Well, if you're carrying out activities that are related to your responsibilities to the institution through your employment, employer feels we have a right to know about those. I'm not saying you can't proceed with that activity.
And then I have a clarification for the question about the religious days. And I apologize to this person if I garbled your question. For the religious days, you had said that anything that may keep a faculty member from working on a grant application on a weekend would need to be reported. That seems inconsistent with the answer.
Well, is it more than 2 days a month in a recurring manner?
Hopefully this person will.
I
weigh
guess
back
we're
in.
also asking about outside professional work.
Yeah.
And we, like your religious practice is probably not outside professional work and it doesn't need to be reported.
Is that because it wouldn't be related to the institutional activities then?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, we have another one. Can you review again how often and the periodicity of when the OAR needs to be submitted? I submitted one back in April this year. Is there any circumstance you can think of for an OAR to be submitted prior to April 30th of next year?
If you have changes to your outside activities report, so you have ownership in a new company in January, you would need to report it within 30 days of acquiring that interest.
Okay.
Or if
So-
you, if you start a new consulting relationship
Okay.
or get a new leadership role somewhere, or even start, if you have a current consulting relationship and all of a sudden you start receiving a lot more income from that, that's something that you'd want to update within 30 days.
Got it. If, and this is my own question, but if you discontinue something, do you also submit an update to your report? If you cease to be an owner of a company or something like that?
You should.
Yeah, you can definitely do that before the annual reporting period, because sometimes we might determine a management plan is no longer necessary if you have one. But I guess, yeah, just telling us whenever there is a change is helpful.
So material change. Okay, cool. I believe that is all the questions that we have had come in. If someone sent one in and I didn't catch it, or it hasn't already been addressed, I apologize, and feel free to preferably use the Q&A function. We have about 5 minutes left. Oh, looks like another one came in from Angela Gibson. If you accept an honorarium for consulting to be directed to your research funds, do you have to report that?
So if the money is going to you directly and then to your research funds, it's reportable. If it goes to UW instead and never to you, then it's not.
Great. Okay. Okay. Great. I believe that is everything that has come in. And if not, we still have a couple minutes. A few more. Or we can leave it there too. If, Andy, okay, take us to the 5 o'clock hour, Andy.
Okay, hi, I'm Andy Richards, and I'm the Director of Discovery to Product here at UW-Madison. Thank you so much for being here today, and it's a really important topic, and really appreciate you clarifying some of that. And as Brian and Stephanie said, we try to tell people that taking your technologies and your ideas outside of the university is really the Wisconsin idea in action. I know we all believe that, so it's really important to understand how best to do that. So in Discovery to Product, we often work with faculty, staff, and students who are trying to commercialize their ideas. And some of them may be a company already and some may not. But they're working with us at Discovery to Product and are often putting in more than 2 8-hour days a month. So as a university entity, working with us, do they need to disclose that?
Not
So-
quite sure I understand the situation if they're working with a company already.
I-
So let's say they
Yeah.
have a company already,
Yeah,
and
I think
then they're
I have
also
a
working
little
with us.
insight into what you're asking. So someone is working with D2P and they don't have a company. They're learning, they're putting together a business model. They're thinking, they're learning from you. There's no entity to report. When they incorporate, there's an entity to report and they should report it. And, I want to thank you, Andy. Most of your people do report it. And we're happy to understand they've reported it and work with them. If they're going to engage with Generator outside of UW-Madison, 4 days a week for 6 months, that's a time commitment that they should report. They're going to engage with your program because they already have an entity and they're committing that time really to the entity. They should report it. I think that you probably have the sense these kind of reporting and understanding of what's going on can generally be dealt with in a favorable manner. And so again, we're trying to engage with people on what they do, understand what they do, and figure out a path forward.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think, thank you everybody for your questions online and in person. Thank you all for your time to come here and talk about this important topic. I know that there are FAQs, I understand, on the website that are really helpful and have a lot of answers to the questions posed as well. And with that, we'll conclude. Have a good Monday night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.